Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my initial review of the Sony Alpha One II, a flagship camera aimed at anyone who demands high-resolution photos and video with fast bursts and sophisticated autofocus. I spent a month with an early sample for this first review, and I hope to follow up with a deeper dive once the camera's raw files are fully supported in third-party software. But I've still got loads of results and details to share with you here, from resolution and noise to video performance and subject recognition. Announced in November 2024, it comes almost 4 years after the original Alpha One and shares many of its headline features, including the same 50.1 megapixel stacked full-frame sensor, 4K 120 and 8K 30 video, and 30 frames per second bursts. It also shares much the same launch price of the original Alpha One at around $6,500, making it the most expensive model in the Alpha series. So far so similar to its predecessor, but by coupling the sensor with their latest image processor, Sony's claiming reduced noise at mid to high ISOs, while other upgrades include long overdue pre-capture bursts, a composite RAW mode to reduce noise, and Sony's latest AI processing unit for much improved subject recognition. Meanwhile, by adopting the A9 III's body, the A1 II gains a 4-axis screen, a handy speed boost capability which can be assigned to a new front customized button, faster wired Ethernet, and claims of improved IBIS that are said to be good for up to 8.5 stops. Sony also claims that the already impressive EVF can now maintain better quality in the smoother 120 frames per second mode. Now, since the A1 sensor hasn't been used since the original model, I'm not personally surprised to see it enjoying a second outing, now enhanced by the latest processor and autofocus. But the upgrades here do represent more of a refresh and illustrate just how capable the original A1 was back in early 2021. To be fair though, even mild upgrades over that model make what's still one of the most capable all-round cameras even better. That said, while the A1 II is no more expensive than its predecessor at launch, the price tag has become more of an ask in 2024. Now, some might argue it just out-resolves its closest rivals in price, including the A9 III and EOS R1, but I say both of those are more specialist sports cameras. For me, the Alpha One concept is more of an all-rounder that combines high speed with very high resolution images, and arguably a closer match in overall features is Canon's EOS R5 II, which costs roughly 2/3 the price. And remember, that model has greatly improved its predecessor's issues of skewing and overheating, while also now including a unique viewfinder that can literally focus wherever you're looking. Nikon's Z9 is also a contender in this rough price bracket. Plus, with the original Alpha One still performing very well today, it's well worth looking for a discounted model or potentially saving even more on the used market, which brings me to MPB, the sponsor of this video. MPB is the largest global platform for used photo and video gear, recirculating over 500,000 cameras, lenses and accessories every year. So whether you're looking for a used bargain, or perhaps you want to sell some gear that you don't need anymore, just head over to their website for an instant quote. For example, at the time I made this video, MPB was selling used Alpha One bodies in excellent condition for around £3,800. That's a saving of around £2,000 over the latest street price. Now, I'm quoting pounds because I'm based in the UK, but they also operate across Europe and the US. I also like that they show photos of the exact model you'll be buying and include a 6-month warranty, something that you won't be getting in a private sale. Meanwhile, that £2,000 you've just saved could be invested in lenses, such as the excellent FE35 1.4G Master or 50 1.4G Master, also selling on MPB for around £1,000 each in excellent condition, and that's saving around £500 each over a new version. Or if your heart's set on a new Alpha One II, you could sell any gear that you're not using to MPB to help fund the purchase. Remember that their quote includes insurance and free collection from your home, and there's no hidden fees or tricky buyers to deal with either. Over the years, I've bought and sold used gear on multiple platforms, but I keep returning to MPB for their simplicity, convenience, and the fact that what they offer you is what you end up getting. So why not check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Right, back to the review. With the scene set, let's now take a look around the A1 II's body, which again is based on the A9 III. Sony's gradually been refining its body design over several generations, and I'm personally very satisfied by the current look and feel, with a nice big comfortable grip and well-positioned controls. Now Sony continues to resist making a body with a built-in grip, but you can always fit the optional VG-C5 battery grip if you'd like more to hold on to, and this approach does allow the body alone to be more compact than say an EOS R1 or a Nikon Z9. On the upper left side there's the familiar two-tiered dial with focus modes at the bottom and drive modes on the top, both with locks which need to be pushed in order to turn. Note the asterisk icon on the drive dial, which transfers drive mode control to the screen menus instead if you prefer. On the upper right side is a straightforward exposure mode dial, atop a simpler collar switching between stills, movies and the S&Q shooting modes, again both with push locks. I prefer having the collar control over the original A1, which had the movie and S&Q modes actually on the main mode dial itself. There's also two customizable thumb dials, the left one turning freely like the front finger dial, and the other one is lockable, but this time with a ballpoint style button. Now I'd have preferred Sony to lock all the dials using the same type of button, as it does feel a little bit inconsistent to have two different styles. But on the plus side, I do prefer that the right hand dial is now unlabelled rather than being dedicated to just exposure compensation as was on the original. And while we're looking at the top right surface, notice the C1 and C2 function buttons, now larger and more pronounced than before, as well as the angled shutter release. Small but nice improvements. From the front, also note the new C5 function button by the lens mount, inherited from the A9 III. This is customizable, but by default activates the speed boost option that can temporarily accelerate the burst speed when you've got it pushed. For example, if 30 frames per second proves a bit excessive during a sustained burst, you could set the standard speed to be slower, say 10 frames per second, and only briefly increase to the faster speeds as you hold the C5 button down, a bit like a shift key. The menus let you choose from 5, 10, 15, 20 or 30 frames per second for this boosted mode, and it can work really well during an extended burst, capturing more frames during those short but critical moments. This is also going to extend your buffer, reduce storage, and also save time when sorting through your images later. Meanwhile, around the back it's pretty much business as usual, with familiar controls including a movie record button by the viewfinder, AF on button, a comfortable joystick, and a tiltable rear thumb wheel. Moving on to the viewfinder, the A1 II inherits the 9.44 million dot OLED panel of the A9 III, A7R5 and the original Alpha 1 with its huge 0.9 times magnification. This delivers a large, very detailed and pretty immersive view in practice. Sony also now supplies the A1 II with two viewfinder eye cups, the standard model and a deeper one which is better at reducing stray light and feels more comfortable in use, especially under bright conditions. I should also mention the A1 II's viewfinder is larger and more detailed than the Canon EOS R5 II, which employs a 5.76 million dot panel with 0.76 times magnification, although in its favour it does also support cunning and surprisingly effective eye-controlled autofocus. Okay, now for a demonstration of the A1 II's viewfinder quality, and this is a live view. If I wiggle my hand in front of the camera, you can see my hand, I can focus on it, and I'm actually filming this view not with an HDMI recorder or anything like that. I've actually got another camera pressed right up against the A1 II's viewfinder. The lens is really touching the viewfinder cup, and this is so I can demonstrate the actual viewfinder image size and the quality options. So if I go to the menu, you can see there's three things we can change here: the magnification, the quality and the frame rate. So I'm going to change the quality first, but before doing that, let's go back to the view, and I want you to keep an eye on these fine lines, and especially inside this circle here, because you're going to see the resolving power change on these in just a moment. So right now some of them are not being resolved very well, but if I now go to the high quality, hopefully you can see that looking much better. In person it looks way sharper. There is way less moire. However, there is something very important to mention that a lot of people will not talk about in reviews because they haven't noticed it necessarily, and that is when I start to focus. Can you see what it is yet? Yep, when you focus the camera, the resolution temporarily decreases. Now this isn't unusual for very high resolution viewfinders. Unfortunately, it's quite common that when you've got them on their top quality mode, when you're focusing, it reduces quality temporarily. Now let's have a look at some other options. So if the viewfinder image is too large, maybe you can't see it fully with eyeglasses on, you can actually choose a shrunken version. And there's two quality settings for that as well. So let's go back to standard and see how that viewfinder image is much smaller than before. And again, we can go for a higher quality version, which is going to resolve more detail. Not quite as much as you had with that full magnification, but there is still a difference. So let's now switch back to the full image magnification, and I'm going to put the image quality on high here and show you what's happening with the actual frame rate. At the moment, we're at the standard frame rate, which I believe for this viewfinder is about 60 frames per second. If I go to the higher frame rate, which I believe is 120 frames per second or thereabouts, this is going to give a smoother view. But look what's happened. The quality option has been grayed out and it says you can no longer have high quality when you're running with the higher frame rate. And if I go back to that live view, you can see the moire has returned. At least it doesn't change while I'm focusing, or not substantially, but we are operating at a lower display quality. But if you were to go for the fastest frame rate, the higher option, notice how the viewfinder has also now shrunk in size. So we've got the shrunken view, we've got the standard quality, and you can see how that looks. However, now you're operating, I believe, at 240 frames per second or thereabouts, and you are getting a very fluid view, especially if you're swinging the camera around for action. So, like other high-end viewfinders, it's a case of balancing the quality against the magnification against the frame rate. There's always going to be one of those compromised. Personally speaking, because I shoot mostly static subjects, I'm quite happy with the standard frame rate, which then allows me to choose the high quality and the full image size. Obviously, I do have that issue while I'm focusing, but as soon as I focus, that image returns to its high resolution. And you also get that full resolution when you're looking in the menus or in playback. Everything is looking really crisp and sharp. Moving on to the screen, the A1 II inherits the 3.2-inch, 2.1 million dot panel of the A9 III and A7R V. That's larger and more detailed than the original A1, while also sporting more flexible 4-axis articulation. This has a side-hinged mechanism that allows the screen to flip out and twist around to face you or back on itself for protection. But what makes it really clever is this mechanism is then mounted on top of a simpler one that pulls out and vertically tilts for a quicker adjustment that remains in line with the optical axis and the tripod thread. This dual approach, first seen on the Panasonic Lumix S1H, successfully solves the problem of which type of articulation a camera should employ. And while it's inevitably thicker than more basic options which either are side-hinged or vertically tilting, Sony's managed to accommodate it here. It's a nice upgrade over the original A1 screen, which only had a vertically tilting motion. Moving on to card slots, the A1 II keeps the pair of dual format slots of its predecessor and other higher end alphas, with each slot able to accommodate either SD or faster CF Express Type A cards. As you'd expect, it's possible to record different media to each card, to auto switch between them, or to duplicate across both cards for backup. Sadly though, despite being Sony's new flagship body, the A1 II won't exploit the extra speed of the latest 4th generation CF Express Type A cards, which means it's no faster at flushing the buffer than its predecessor. This also means that rival cameras which use the larger Type B format can typically enjoy card speeds twice as fast, not to mention being generally cheaper per gigabyte too. But the older 3rd generation Type A cards, such as Sony's own TUF series to date, are still roughly twice as fast as the very best SD cards out there. And crucially, unlike some rivals, Sony doesn't force you to buy into CF Express just to support their most demanding features. It's possible to shoot 8K video or 50 megapixel bursts at 30 frames per second with a decent SD card. So the only real benefit of CF Express is being able to flush the buffer faster. To demonstrate the difference between the card slots, you're watching a 20 frames per second burst of uncompressed RAW files being written to a Sony TUF SD card rated at 299 megabytes per second. Notice the speed of this process in the corner of the screen as it's writing those images to the card. Now let's switch the cards to one of Sony's 3rd generation CF Express Type A cards rated at 700 megabytes per second for writes, and you can see just how much faster the buffer is being cleared. So, if you're shooting large bursts of raw images and want the camera to remain responsive to more of them, I'd recommend investing in CF Express. And while I've used a Sony card here, you may want to also consider a 4th generation OWC card, as at least you will be able to enjoy their faster speed on 4th gen card readers, and they're also competitively priced. But if you're only shooting JPEG bursts, the buffer will clear pretty quickly even with a fast SD card. In terms of ports, the A12 is equipped with 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, each behind separate flaps, and the former clearing the screen mechanism. Behind a shared flap are USB-C and a full-sized HDMI Type-A port. The USB-C port supports 3.2 speeds and can be used for charging the battery, powering the camera, tethering, or as a standard webcam up to 4K 30p. Meanwhile, the HDMI port can output a variety of video formats including RAW to compatible recorders. Like many of Sony's cameras, there's also an older micro USB port which can provide an alternative power input, allowing you to keep the camera running while the USB-C port may be tethering or working as a webcam. There's also a PC sync port for external lighting and a wired network socket, but now upgraded to 2.5 gigabit speeds as an alternative to USB for tethered shooting or file transfer. For power, the A12 continues to employ the trusty FZ100 pack, with Sony initially quoting around 420 shots in the specs, but this is going to hugely vary depending on your usage. For example, I shot closer to 1,000 images in a mix of mechanical and electronic bursts, along with several video clips on a single charge. If you want more battery power, the optional VG C5 grip will accommodate 2 battery packs, along with providing portrait controls including a duplicate C5 custom button. There's also a new BC-ZD1 dual charger supplied with the A12 and also sold separately if you like, which can charge 2 batteries simultaneously from a USB power delivery supply. Moving on to imaging, the A12 inherits the same 50.1 megapixel stack sensor as its predecessor, shooting at the same top speed of 30 frames per second. Now, while some may be disappointed that Sony's not designed a new sensor for the A12, nor even managed to squeeze more speed out of this one, it is important to remember that this is only its second outing, and the combination of resolution and speed still remains one of the best around. Couple it with one of Sony's recent G Master lenses and you're going to enjoy tremendous detail with low noise, while also being able to capture fast action with minimal distortion. It's this combination that still makes the A1 series so compelling, and I've got absolutely no complaints with the image quality or the speed in my tests. From the image quality menu, you can choose JPEG or 2 types of HIF for compressed images, and either of those in the choice of 4 compression levels and uncropped resolutions of 50, 21 or 12 megapixels. You can also choose from 4 aspect ratios, although 4:3, 16:9 and 1:1 are all cropped. Meanwhile, RAW shooters have the choice of uncompressed and lossy compressed at the full resolution, or a lossless compressed option in the same large, medium or small sizes as JPEGs. If you're after more detail, the A12 inherits the pixel shift mode of its predecessor, which captures 4 or 16 RAW files using IBIS to slightly nudge the sensor between each of them. These are then combined later to generate an image with potentially more detail and reduced color moire. Unfortunately, for all of the processing muscle under the hood, the A12 is still unable to combine them in camera, so you're going to need to import them into Sony software on your computer later to perform the composite process. Now, this wasn't ready for the A12 at the time that I made this initial video, so I'm going to save it for my follow-up. New to the A12, inherited from the A9 III, is a second composite RAW mode, this time designed to reduce noise. You can capture 4, 8, 16 or 32 images in a burst, again combining them in Sony software later. Now, the A9 III exploited its 120 frames per second burst to capture them handheld in a split second, although with a top speed of 30 frames per second, this becomes more of a tripod-based operation on the A12. Again, I'm going to have examples of this in my follow-up video. As a quick aside, Canon's dumped pixel shifting on the R5 II in favour of AI-based upscaling or noise reduction options, both of which can be performed in camera, and I have some examples in my initial review of that model. Returning to the A12, I can however show you the noise levels for out-of-camera JPEGs across the sensitivity range, so let's take a closer look at this still life scene at 50mm f8, starting at the extended low 50 ISO. Here there's a tremendous amount of fine detail thanks to the sensor resolution and G Master optics. As I gradually increase the sensitivity, this detail is maintained up to 400 ISO, with only a mild drop at 800 ISO. From 1600 ISO onwards, there's more of a visible decline, although it's still pretty respectable up to 6400 ISO. But at 12800, fine details have taken a serious hit, while those top 3 sensitivities of 25600 to 102,400 ISO are smeared and noisy. Interestingly, while Sony claims improvements in mid to high ISOs on the A1 II, I actually noticed quality drops at similar points to my original A1 tests, so I'm really going to have to make a side-by-side comparison in order to confirm any benefits. But let's return to that 100 ISO sample and remind ourselves of the quality that's possible at the lower end of the range. And again, once the RAW files are fully supported, I'll make an updated comparison, as well as trying out those new composite noise reduction modes, and of course testing the dynamic range too. Moving on to stabilization, the A1 II features Sony's latest sensor shift IBIS, now claiming up to 8.5 stops of compensation in the middle of the frame. I believe that's the highest that they've claimed so far. Now you're looking at a shot taken with the A1 II and a 70mm lens at 1/5 of a second, and that's the slowest that I could personally handhold a sharp result using IBIS alone. This was using an unstabilized lens, so you're looking at IBIS alone here. And now on the right, the same shutter speed, but with IBIS turned off, showing how much camera shake was present. Indeed, at the time of testing, I needed a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second to handhold a sharp result at 70mm without any stabilization. So in this particular example, the A1 II was giving me 4 stops of compensation, coincidentally the same that I measured for the original A1, and that's far short of the 8.5 stops claimed by Sony, but your mileage will almost certainly vary. Moving on, the A1 II offers the choice of a traditional mechanical or electronic shutter, or an auto mode which chooses between them. In mechanical mode, the top shutter speed is 8,000th of a second, with the camera making a quiet but positive snapping sound, while the electronic mode extends the top speed to 32,000th of a second and can operate in complete silence or with an artificial sound effect. Meanwhile, the flash sync speed is 400th of a second or 500th if shooting in the cropped APS-C mode, and those speeds are with the mechanical shutter, or at 200th of a second for the electronic shutter. In terms of bursts, the A1 II's mechanical shutter can fire at up to 10 frames per second, and it sounds like this. Switch to the electronic shutter and you can fire at up to 30 frames per second depending on format, and that sounds like this. You can also reduce the electronic burst to 5, 10, 15 or 20 frames per second and assign different speeds to the drive mode dial options. In my own tests, I was able to achieve the top speeds with continuous AFC using Sony's own lenses. I also confirmed that the maximum burst speed for RAW files in uncompressed and lossless compressed formats reduces to 20 frames per second, so you can only enjoy the maximum 30 frames per second speed for RAW files if you're using the compressed mode. In these respects, it's the same as the original A1. And like all Sony cameras, you'll also only enjoy the fastest electronic burst speeds with continuous autofocus when using Sony's own lenses, and preferably recent ones too. Now this may be a technical restriction, perhaps related to the focusing or the aperture diaphragm speed, or maybe it's simple protectionism. I tried the A1 II with a Sigma 100-400 DGDN and found it could operate at the full 30 frames per second in single AFS mode, but in continuous AFC mode it fell to around 15 frames per second. To be fair though, I'm not sure how many A1 II owners would be using third-party lenses, but I did think it was worth knowing if you want to exploit the full speed of the camera when using continuous autofocus. As mentioned earlier, you can also configure 2 different speeds for the electronic bursts on the A1 II, with the faster option only activating as you push and hold down the front C5 custom button as a temporary boost, a handy feature introduced on the A9 III. Also inherited from the A9 III is a pre-capture mode, a long overdue feature from Sony, but at least highly customizable here. This exploits the electronic shutter to keep a rolling buffer of frames as you half press the shutter release, only committing the most recent frames to your card when you fully push down on the shutter button. The idea being you keep the shutter half pressed as you wait for the critical moment to happen, then you fully push down when you actually see it, safe in the knowledge that you're also going to have the previous split second in the bank. Unlike many cameras which just offer a fixed buffer time though, the A1 II offers 17 pre-capture settings, from as little as 0.03 seconds to a whole second. The actual number of frames captured in that time depends on what burst speed you've selected, allowing you to balance the numbers. So, as an example, here's Steven Seagal taking flight using the pre-capture mode, with the buffer set to half a second and the burst speed to the fastest 30 frames per second. This means the first 15 frames here were taken before I fully pushed down on the shutter release, allowing me to grab the exact moment of flight, as well as the moments before and after. Now, it's taken Sony a long time to implement pre-capture on its range, but at least we have it now on an Alpha 1. But the practicality of an electronic shutter very much depends on how much skewing is visible on subjects as you or they move. The original A1 reduced its rolling shutter effect with a stacked sensor design, so let's now see how it looks on the A1 II. So here's a panning burst with a 35mm lens using the mechanical shutter at 10 frames per second, and as you'd expect, the bottle is remaining vertical. Now for the same panning speed, but this time using the electronic shutter at 30 frames per second, so with more frames per second the pan is going to appear slower here, but the important part is to check out the vertical lines, and while there is a very small amount of skewing visible, I'd say it's looking pretty minimal here. For direct comparison, here's the mechanical shutter on the left, and the electronic shutter on the right, where again I'd say the rolling shutter is looking pretty well behaved, especially considering the high resolution of the sensor. It's pretty much as good as you're going to get without the current cost and quality hit of a global sensor. Okay, now onto focusing, and before doing anything else you're looking at the A1 II fitted with the 70-200 at 70mm 2.8, pulling focus quickly and without fuss with a single area. The A1 II also gets a broader choice of single AF areas from extra large to extra small, as well as highly customizable zones. But arguably the biggest electronic upgrade on the A1 II over the original model is employing Sony's latest AI processing unit to support far more sophisticated subject recognition. Like other bodies with this component, the A1 II can now recognize insects, cars, planes and trains, as well as sporting improved detection for people, birds and animals. It represents a substantial enhancement over the original A1, and now for the first time on any alpha body also includes an auto mode which attempts to detect the actual type of subject itself. So let's see it in action. Okay, so on the left you're looking at the A1 II with human selected as the subject type, while on the right is the new auto mode which has to guess the subject type first. In both cases I'm using a 70-200 at 70mm 2.8. Now I'd say in terms of recognising me as a human target, it's pretty much neck and neck, and there's essentially nothing to choose between them in profile or at a distance, so an impressive start. So now let's see how it handles birds, once again using the 70-200 but now at 200 2.8. And again I'd say there's no real difference in reaction time or accuracy here. The auto mode is simply recognising the main subject as a bird and locking onto it without any fuss. How about birds in flight though? Again, similar performance in my test between the dedicated bird and auto modes, although I will mention, anecdotally, that the birds need to be a bit larger on the frame than I found when using Canon's latest AF system to be recognised as a subject with an actual box around it. To see how it all comes together in practice, here's a selection of birds taken with the A1 II and the 70-200 2.8 G Master, mostly at 200mm 2.8. Again, I tried switching between auto and bird modes and found them to be similar except in the most brief opportunities when the dedicated bird mode responded a fraction faster. Speaking of which, bonus points to both the Sony A1 II and Canon R5 II for being able to recognise and focus sharply on a bird in a split second as it swoops into the frame and past your head. On Brighton Pier, the seagulls can get pretty excited when there's plenty of tourist chips and donuts around at the weekend, but they don't hang around for long in one place. They're literally darting around at times at very close range. You might be able to hear them in the background, and I was impressed by how quickly both of these top-end bodies reacted. Suffice it to say, more leisurely or predictable subjects like cyclists or vehicles were an absolute doddle in comparison. I'd say for general use and even mild action, the new auto subject detection is as effective as the dedicated subject modes, and you can improve its accuracy by removing certain subject types like cars or planes if you know you're not going to be aiming at them. But if you do know that you're only going to be concentrating on one type of subject in a session, the dedicated modes will prove more responsive, especially in very fast or spontaneous scenarios. Plus, wildlife photographers also have their own mini auto mode, which only looks for birds and animals. I look forward to seeing these subject enhancements on all future alpha bodies. I'm also hoping to try out the A1 II with some sports action for my follow-up video, and in particular seeing how it compares to Canon's latest action priority mode in the R5 II and R1. Now this can recognise and predict the movement of not just the players in a sport, but the ball in some sports, knowing when it's been passed or it's about to be dunked or spiked. Now for the video capabilities, which are essentially the same as the original A1, at least in terms of resolution, frame rate and rolling shutter. Like other recent Sony bodies, there's a wealth of formats and options available, and I'll show you some of the menus with the camera set to the PAL region, because that's where I'm based. You can film in 1080 or 4K from 24 to 120p with audio and autofocus, all uncropped apart from 4K 120, which has about a 10% reduction. Meanwhile, 8K is available from 24 to 30p in XAVC HS only. Oh, and in case you wondered, XAVC HS 4K still starts at 50 or 60p, so if you want 4K at 24 to 30p, you'll need to use XAVC-S or XAVC-SI, although note the I version won't go higher than 50 or 60p. Also note that all video modes are 16:9 shaped only, without the option to capture wider DCI or taller OpenGate formats, and there's also no internal ProRes or RAW recording either, making Sony's current codecs look a bit limited versus some rivals. If you want even higher frame rates, turn to the S&Q mode, which can capture 1080 up to 240p with autofocus, albeit with no sound. Unlike other recent Sony cameras, the log options are in their own menu, which makes more sense to me in order to find them more easily, although it does mean that there is a gap left in the picture profile list, which can be a bit confusing for anyone moving from an older body. And when in log mode, you'll also be able to output RAW over HDMI to a compatible recorder. Okay, let's now have a look at some footage in practice, all filmed with the A1 II and a 35 1.4 G Master lens, starting with 1080 at 25p, which is uncropped widthways. And now for 1080 at 50p, where the view remains uncropped, and from this subject the detail looks pretty much the same. Likewise for 1080 at 100p here, so again no crop and no obvious loss of detail compared to the slower frame rates. And now for 1080 at 200p using the S&Q mode, where you'll notice a fairly substantial crop, which I measured at about 1.25 times. But you still get autofocus, and in terms of quality, it's looking pretty similar to the other 1080 modes here. No, I'm using PAL frame rates in my tests here, but in terms of quality and crops, 25, 50, 100 and 200p are equivalent to 30, 60, 120 and 240p respectively in the NTSC regions. So let's now return to 1080 at 25p for comparison before switching to 4K 25p, again uncropped here and showing a visible boost in detail, at least on my 4K timeline. And next at 4K 50p, which remains uncropped and maintains the same degree of detail, unlike some models which either crop and or reduce their quality in 4K above 30p. And next for 4K at 100p, which incurs a crop, albeit milder than at 1080 200p. I measured it here at about 1.12 times, but again the actual overall quality still looks pretty good, and you're getting autofocus and sound. And now back to 4K 25p for comparison, before switching to 8K at 25p, which is gonna look similar on my 4K timeline here, but with the benefit of being able to crop in by 2 times and still maintain 4K's worth of detail. And if your end goal is 4K, filming in 8K will give you a lot of reframing potential, but if you'd like to repurpose the same clip for wide and tall platforms, I think an OpenGate mode that records the full height of the sensor will involve less compromise. I really wish Sony would support OpenGate, as not only would it give you more flexibility when reframing manually, but it could work so well when feeding the auto framing mode, which coincidentally is also now available on the A1 II. In terms of video autofocus, you're looking at the A1 II fitted with the 70-200 2.8 at 70mm 2.8, smoothly pulling focus with a single AF area. That's easy, so now with the full area using auto subject detection here, effortlessly tracking me around the frame. Now you're going to find the same wealth of subject options here as the photo menus, and again the auto subject detection work to treat in all but the most demanding environments. Slow motion is also a highlight on the A1 II, with great quality 4K video available up to 120p with sound and autofocus, and with only a mild crop to the field of view. You're watching 4K 100p here, slowed by 4 times on my 25p timeline, and notice how the camera manages to keep the fast moving birds sharply focused throughout most of the action. It'll also work well for most moving subjects, so long as they're not too fast. It proved fine for my tests with domestic pets and amateur sports, and I hope to try it out with more demanding subjects in the future. Okay, now hold on to your lunch as it's time for a rolling shutter test, all filmed at 35mm and starting in 1080 25p, where the stacked sensor is keeping skewing mostly at bay. Likewise in 1080 50p here, and also in 1080 at 100p. Next for 4K at 25p, where there's a similar result. If you really shake the camera, you'll see a little skewing, but it's not bad at all. Likewise at 4K 50p, and again in 4K 100p. Switching to 8K here is revealing a little more skewing than before in this particular test, so use with a little more caution, but overall about as well behaved as you can expect for a non-global sensor. And just before finally wrapping up, a quick word on recording times and overheating. Like other alpha cameras to date, there's no active cooling on the A1 II nor even any fan accessories to mount, merely the auto power off temperature option, which when set to high lets the camera run hotter to allow longer recording times. I made a number of tests using a 128GB Sony SD card with the camera's screen flipped out and running under battery power alone, indoors at room temperature without air conditioning or heating. Set to XAVCS HD in 1080-25p, I managed just over 158 minutes, that's more than 2.5 hours, in a single recording before the battery expired without any overheating issues. Set to XAVCS in 4K 25p, I managed a single recording lasting almost 119 minutes, so just about 2 hours, before the battery again expired with the camera feeling warm but not hot. So for general recordings, battery power is going to be the limiting factor, and if you want longer, you could always go for the dual battery grip or power the camera over USB. Switching to 8K 25p though proved more demanding, with my A1 II recording 61 minutes before it switched itself off due to heat, with about 30% battery remaining. The body felt very warm in places, but still not hot, and was happy to record again a few moments later, albeit not for as long. Likewise for 4K at 100p, where the camera managed to record 85 minutes before it shut itself down due to overheating, with battery charge remaining. Again, I was able to record subsequent clips pretty much straight away, albeit only for a few minutes at first. After cooling for a bit longer though, I did manage to record another hour's worth of 4K 100. Which now brings me to my verdict so far, during which I'll share some more sample images taken with the A1 II and mostly either the 35mm 1.4G Master or the 70-200 2.8G Master. When I first heard the specifications for the Alpha 1 II, I felt a little bit underwhelmed. Despite its flagship status and pretty high price, there's no major new features here, just a series of smaller updates to refresh the camera and bring it up to date on autofocus and body design. Almost all the new features have been inherited from previous bodies, most notably the A9 III, and while it is nice to have more sophisticated subject detection, the pre-capture bursts, a highly flexible screen and speed boost mode, the actual biggest new feature making its debut here is auto subject recognition. And even as a champion of CF Express Type A memory, Sony's slots on this camera will not exploit the extra speed of the latest 4th generation cards. I'd say there's little reason for existing A1 owners to upgrade unless they really value the improved subject detection and, say, pre-capture modes. Some will also be disappointed there's no new sensor or boost in frame rate here, but to be fair, Sony traditionally uses parts more than once, and this is only the second outing for the A1 sensor, so it's not surprising to see it here. I think it's also important to manage your expectations and ask whether you really actually need more than 50 megapixels or over 30 frames per second bursts. Some may, but for me it's certainly plenty, with the body capturing hugely detailed images in fast bursts with barely any skewing to mention. But equally, you could already do that with the original A1, and the new model illustrates just how much its predecessor got right and achieved several years ago. And while the A1 II price may be similar to the A1 at launch, without even taking inflation into account, the market has moved on. After all, not only can you now buy discounted or used Alpha 1 bodies at a lower price, but Canon's EOS R5 Mark II has become a compelling alternative at roughly 2/3 the cost. It's resolved most of its issues with skewing and overheating, while also including their cunning eye control viewfinder and clever action priority autofocus. Ultimately, while the A1 II may only represent a mild refresh over its predecessor, this still makes it Sony's most powerful overall alpha body, and one that is truly worthy of the flagship status. Just don't expect many brand new features. In my tests, it easily handled anything I asked of it, and it never let me down. So the big question for potential buyers though is whether it's worth investing the extra over a discounted or a used Alpha 1. Which brings me to the end of my initial review of the A1 II. As I mentioned at the start, I hope to follow up with a test of the RAW capabilities once the files are broadly supported, especially in third-party software, but do let me know if there's anything else that you'd like to see me test. As always, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you find what I do useful here, please do consider giving this video a like and my channel a follow. It really helps me to make more of these reviews. Thanks again for watching, and thanks also to MPB for sponsoring this video. If you have any photo gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at the links in the description. Thanks for watching again, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.